Since I was little, my grandmother used to tell me stories about the house where she lived. She said it was haunted. I never knew whether to believe her. I always thought they were typical grandmother stories, just to make conversation. She was very devout, to the point where she prayed the Rosary every day, without fail. But there was something strange about it, because every time she did, strange things would happen. I never saw anything, but the stories she told me seemed very real. My grandmother said there was a presence in the house, something that only appeared when she prayed. I thought it might be her imagination due to old age, loneliness, or something similar, but she was convinced it was real. I don't know, it's hard to explain. The only thing I know is that my grandmother never lied to me about anything, and that includes her stories. The first encounter was something my grandmother never forgot. It was one night when my mother and father were visiting the house and stayed there. Everyone was already asleep, and she was in her room praying the Rosary. The house was silent, only normal noises could be heard, creaking wood, the wind outside. But then, while praying, she said she felt something strange, like a change in the air, a heavy feeling, as if someone were watching her. But there was no one else in her room. She slept alone. My grandmother continued praying, trying to ignore that feeling. But then, she saw something. At first, she thought her eyes were deceiving her because she couldn't see very well due to complications from diabetes. But she insists it was there. A shadow darker and denser than usual was right in the corner of her room. My grandmother said she froze. She didn't know whether to pray or run, but with knee problems, running wasn't really an option. So, she did the only thing she felt she could do. She closed her eyes and prayed. But I think she hoped that when she opened them again, everything would return to normal. But when she opened them, the shadow was still there. Only this time it seemed to have come a little closer. It made no noise. It was just there, watching her. My grandmother didn't tell me much more about that encounter. The last thing I know is that she stopped looking and focused her gaze straight ahead. At some point, the shadow disappeared. After that, things were never the same. When she prayed, she always felt that presence, that feeling of being watched. It didn't happen every night, but often enough for her to notice, and it was always when she was alone, never when there were other people around. My grandmother didn't stop praying the Rosary after that, but she began to do it during the day or when there were people in the house. She said that somehow it made her feel safer, as if a higher power was asking her to do so. Although she never stopped glancing at the corner of her room, she never saw the shadow as clearly as the first time. The feeling that something was there with her never disappeared. My grandmother also told me that things began to get strange in the house, more than usual. Remember how I said she claimed her house was haunted? Well, many things happened there. The typical case where dishes or anything else was out of place was constant. The phenomena became more frequent and increasingly nasty. There came a point where my grandmother had to accept what was happening. She realized that it was the Rosary that, somehow, was bringing that shadow close to her. I can imagine how difficult it must have been for her to choose between faith and peace. In the end, she decided to stop praying the Rosary forever. It wasn't easy, she told me many times. This decision came with many internal conflicts because, for her, her faith was a big part of who she was. However, the idea of continuing to attract that presence was unbearable. I can't help but feel a mix of admiration and sadness. Admiration for my grandmother's strength to make such a decision and sadness for what she had to sacrifice.
I was about 21 years old when this started happening. My mother, an elderly woman but still full of energy, began having dreams. She wasn't one of those religious people who went to Mass every Sunday, but suddenly she changed. She began dreaming that God was speaking to her, telling her to go to church, and she, without a second thought, obeyed. I remember the first time I saw her get out of bed in the middle of the night. It was 3 a.m. I went to the bathroom and saw her getting dressed. "Mom, what are you doing?" I asked her. With that serious look she had when something really mattered to her, she said, "I have to go to church." I dreamed that God asked me to. I was groggy and confused, just nodded and went back to bed. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was becoming more frequent. Sometimes late at night, other times early in the morning. Each dream was an order for her. The church had Mass at midnight and at 6 a.m. and there she was, participating as if her life depended on it. At first, I thought it was something temporary, but as weeks went by, it became a routine. One morning, while we were having breakfast, I asked why she did it, why those dreams were so important to her. She looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes, fear. In the dreams, God tells me that if I don't go to church, the devil will take me, she told me, with a voice that left no room for doubt. I didn't know whether to believe her or not, but the seriousness with which she spoke sent chills down my spine. She was silent for a moment, as if gathering the courage to tell me the rest. Then, in a low voice, almost a whisper, she began her story. It all started one night when I dreamed I had to go to the midnight mass. I arrived at the church, and it was almost empty, just a few people scattered across the pews. I sat in one of them, closed my eyes, and started to pray. But my daughter, in the middle of the prayer, I felt something strange, like a presence approaching me. My mother paused, took a sip of coffee, and continued. I opened my eyes and saw a man standing in front of me. He didn't look like a normal man. His eyes were deeply black, as if they were hollow. He looked at me intently, and at that moment, I felt a fear I had never experienced before. It was as if this man knew everything about me, as if he could see my soul. What happened? I asked her. The only thing I could do was keep praying more fervently, and then the man started to speak. His voice was cold, distorted. He said meaningless things, words in a language I didn't understand. And the worst part, he started laughing, a laugh that wasn't human and echoed throughout the empty church. My mother stopped. It seemed like she was reliving that moment right in front of me. That laugh haunted her in her dreams. After that, she continued, I knew he wasn't an ordinary man. He was something else, something evil. I felt that if I didn't keep going to church, if I didn't obey the dreams God sent me, something terrible would happen to me. She finished her story and silence filled the kitchen. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe it was her imagination, but the other part, which saw the genuine fear in her eyes, knew there was some truth to her words. After hearing my mother's story, something changed in me. Now, I had fear and respect for her beliefs. The following week, I watched my mother continue going to church with increasing fervor. She began to pray more at home and keep religious images around. It was as if she was in a constant battle with something we couldn't see. That was the only time we talked about those dreams and her experience at church. My mother passed away a few years later, peacefully in her bed, as if she had finally found peace. After her death, I went through a period of reflection. Sometimes, at night, I would wonder if she was fighting something real or if it had all been a product of her mind. Every time these thoughts crossed my mind, I remember the expression in her eyes when she told me her story. Just from her fear, I know it was real.
My older sister has a special sensitivity to the paranormal. Unlike her, the strangest thing that ever happened to me was hearing my name being called in empty rooms. I never saw anything. On the other hand, there are several stories that, honestly, can be quite frightening, especially because of the way she tells them. These experiences have made me develop a deep respect for these phenomena. My mother was involved with a man who knew several interesting places in the state where he lived. One of these places is a church located at the top of a hill. It is said that it was built at the request of a famous priest, and that the men didn't live long due to exposure to harmful gases or coal. I'm not very familiar with the details of this story, but I read online that, as a tradition, the groom must carry his future wife up the stairs to the church to show his true love. This act might explain the church's unusual location. When we arrived in the town, I remember there was a football game going on. My mother and her partner decided to stay and watch from the hill, while my sister and I opted to visit the church. Upon arrival, we first went to the back, where there is a ruined building that was supposedly a school at that time. Some planks from what had been the floor were still preserved. After exploring that area, we decided to enter the church. The door was ajar, held by a chain, and some furniture was placed inside blocking the entrance, probably to prevent access. However, someone had made space to get in. Inside, we met a family of 3, a father, mother, and child, who were also inspecting the place, which gave us more confidence to enter. I remember that the pews were decorated with purple paper ribbons stretched from end to end. This led me to assume that they had recently celebrated Easter, as the paper didn't seem deteriorated. In the space where the figure of Christ would have been, only the silhouette of the stain indicating his former presence remained, with only a pulpit left, without a table for the chalice or any other objects. Looking to the right, there was a kind of room where the priest would prepare for Massachusetts. This room was empty, with only two entrances, one leading to the inside and another leading to the outside, closed with a chain and padlock. I don't remember seeing more than maybe a few forgotten pieces of furniture. When the family began to leave, only my sister and I remained. I didn't pay much attention to my sister at the time because my goal was to climb to a balcony or platform above the front door. Just as I was about to climb, my sister called me, saying, "Miguel, let's go with Mom. We'll come back later." When I turned around, she was already walking away without saying another word. I followed her to the stairs and asked if we could go back to the balcony to see what was there. That's when she revealed to me that she had seen a man in the room I had found. My sister had only seen part of a brown robe and a leg, as if he had been watching us. Although I initially doubted her story, this event became an intriguing anecdote. Years later, while working at a convenience store, I read a section in the newspaper about paranormal experiences, where people mentioned having seen a monk in a brown robe in that same church. This story confirmed what my sister had seen, making me understand that she truly had the ability to see things that I cannot, something that, despite my interest in the paranormal, I appreciate because there are experiences I would prefer not to live through personally.
I was 16 years old. My father and I didn't go to church very often, but that Sunday we did. He decided it was a good day to attend Mass, and I had no choice but to accompany him. Upon entering the church, it was almost full, which was unusual as it was usually quite empty. We sat in one of the back pews near the entrance. Everything started normally, the priest in his place, people paying attention, and so on. But in the middle of the Mass, something happened. At first, when I saw it, I think I didn't believe it. I wasn't processing it. I can't explain it to you, but part of me saw it as if it were something, like a cat walking around. I don't know, it was strange, but then I realized I wasn't the only one. Looking at the altar, a very dark and completely visible shadow moved from one side to the other. There was no source, it wasn't a person or an object, it was just there, moving slowly, almost crawling across the floor. It had no feet and extended across the altar floor. Most people remained silent. Some I saw making the sign of the cross, others just stood there with their mouths open. The shadow never stopped, as if it didn't notice or care that there were other people present. I remember it had no eyes or mouth. The clearest or easiest way I can describe it is like a man made of clay, but with an almost invisible smoky texture. Sorry, but it's obviously not easy to explain. This thing moved a meter or two and then began to dissolve. It was as if it had evaporated, as if its body was merging with the air. The priest, who had interrupted the Mass for a moment, was also surprised but didn't seem frightened. He calmly asked us to pray not for ourselves, but for that soul that, according to him, had decided to visit us. The fact that the priest understood it this way, I don't know how to interpret. Maybe his view of the world, as someone devout, didn't scare him as much, or maybe he just wanted to keep the parishioners calm. I don't consider myself very religious, but I believe there are aspects of our world that we don't fully understand, and this event confirmed that for me.
Please, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more content.